Mr. Netanyahu, Prime Minister Netanyahu, he announces, he says, the idea to withdraw from Gaza, that came to me from the Italian Foreign Minister. The Italian Foreign Minister. It's the first time, I think, in the history of the world, the Italian Foreign Minister had an idea. The Italian Foreign Minister gets his little part, called in English a cameo appearance. And then, lo and behold, about 5 days ago, Canada, CBC, it has a documentary, 3 parts, a 3-part documentary. Who killed Rafik Hariri? And it's based on secret, leaked information, which only they got access to. Now, anyone want to guess who they figured out killed Rafik Hariri? Was the Hezbollah. Now, you know, I've been to Canada many times. I like Canada. I do. I like the people very much. It's a very decent place. But truth be told, I don't think there are more than 2 or 3 people in all of Canada who ever heard of Rafik Hariri. So, why is CBC having a 3-part special on who killed Rafik Hariri? But you'll see, every country in the world will soon have a special on who killed Rafik Hariri. There will even be a special on who killed Rafik Hariri by Fiji television. Because they have to work up the hysteria. You remember the Saddam Hitler hysteria, and then the Milosevic Hitler hysteria, and now it's going to have to be the Hezbollah Hitler hysteria. They're going to have to work up the whole hysteria to prepare for the assault. And the assault is going to be something quite horrible. Now we end with the humor, and we have to be sober. The Israelis have already said, in the event of the next war, they're going to continue to apply what they call the Dahya doctrine. Anybody here from Lebanon? Raise your hand so you know. The Dahya is the southern suburb of Beirut. And it's Dahya. It's the southern suburb of Beirut. And it's home to the mostly poor Shia population in the area, which is very loyal to the Hezbollah, civilian population loyal to Hezbollah. And the 2006 war, Israel turned the Dahya into a parking lot. There was nothing left. I saw it right after. It looked like typical scenes from World War II. It's just all flat, except for the craters. Israel was very pleased with what it did with the Dahya, and it coined the term. It was called the Dahya doctrine. And that just means using pulverizing force against civilians and civilian population. The first application of the doctrine was in Gaza. But Israel said after, we're going to use it again. And that means Lebanon. On one point, Israel and the Hezbollah, they agreed. The Israeli officials have said the next war will be game-changing. I'm not sure if the German translation is right, game-changing. Hezbollah says the next war will change the face of this region. The next war will change the face of this region. Mr. Nasrallah has been giving speeches over the past year, and over again he said that the Arab Muslim world will no longer be used as Israel's shooting gallery. In the event of another war, he said, it will be an airport for an airport, a port for a port, a city for a city, a building for a building, a power station for a power station, a factory for a factory. Now say what you will about Zionist Rabbah, but everyone can agree that his entire reputation, and he knows it, it rests on the fact that there's an exact correspondence between his words and his deeds, which means there's every reason to suppose that Nasrallah means what he says and will, in fact, must do what he promises. And now you have to ask yourself, what's going to happen when the Hezbollah rockets start hitting Tel Aviv? How will the Israelis react when there's a substantial accumulation of civilian casualties starting to run into the hundreds? What will Israel do? Israel has already said repeatedly in the past year that it expects in the next war the missiles will hit Tel Aviv. Actually, the retired head of Israeli military intelligence, he just gave a briefing last week, his last day, and he said this calm in the region is deceiving. And he said, we expect in the next war, the missiles will hit Tel Aviv. The prospect grows more terrifying when you bear in mind that everything I might have said thus far, I'll agree, it's speculation of a higher or lower degree, but it's speculation. But on one point, there's no speculation. And that point is Israel will not accept another defeat in Lebanon. It's just not possible. If it looks as if a defeat is impending, then Israel will do what it has to do to make sure they don't suffer a third consecutive defeat in Lebanon. On the other hand, even if it looks as if the Hezbollah is losing, it's very unlikely that Iran will stay out, not from any particular solidarity, but from the knowledge that if Hezbollah is defeated, they're next. And so the pressure on Iran to intervene will be very strong if it looks like the Hezbollah is losing. What exactly will happen is, of course, impossible to predict. But I think the Americans, the French, and the British, and all the rest of them, what they're hoping to do is to so isolate the Hezbollah with these sanctions, resolutions, the documentaries, the hysteria, the secret information, and so forth, that it'll make it impossible for Iran to intervene, because then it'll be accused of being a sanctions breaker and supporting the satanic Hezbollah. But on the other hand, it'll be hard for them to stay out. There are variables. Mr. Erdogan, the head of Turkey, was in Lebanon the last few days, and he said, speaking directly to Israel, he said, stop the incitement in Lebanon. And now Said Hariri, the head of state of Lebanon, is in Iran. Because everybody understands what's coming, and the question is whether they can head it off. An Israeli attack on Hezbollah would consequently trigger a chain reaction, the outcome of which no sane person would want to contemplate. Where do we stand now? Well, there were some hopeful moments after the martyrdom of the members of the Freedom Flotilla. The pressure seemed to be exerted on Israel that it had to lift the siege of Gaza. I myself was, I think, rather naively hopeful, but Israel managed to, the storm passed, and now John Ging, who's the director of operations for UNRWA, the main UN relief organization in Gaza, he said this past week that there is no tangible change for the people on the ground. It still is what it was. On the other hand, I think it would be wrong to underestimate the achievement of the people on the Freedom Flotilla. For a few moments, they managed to force the hands of the world's mightiest powers. For 3 years, that brutal, merciless, heartless blockade of Gaza was imposed without a peep, without a word from the international community. But the day after the martyrdom on the Marmara, all the world leaders suddenly discovered, every one of them was amazing, it was a revelation. They all discovered that the blockade of Gaza was unsustainable and it had to be lifted. The prison gates of Gaza have only been opened a few tiny inches at most, but those inches show the latent power of a movement built on the simple truth that the occupation is inhuman and unjust. If the people of the Mavi Marmara showed us what to do, then the people in Washington, Tel Aviv, and Ramallah, they show us what not to do. Because there never has been, there isn't now, and there won't be for the foreseeable future, a peace process. That's not rhetoric. That's what a rational person concludes, looking at the factual record. The peace process was said to have begun in September 1993 with the Oslo Accord and the famous handshake. Now 17 years have passed, and we hear peace process, peace process, peace process, peace process. But a rational person, he or she judges by results, by outcomes, not by words. So let's try to be rational. In September 1993, there were 250,000 illegal Jewish settlers in the occupied Palestinian territories. 17 years later, in 2010, there are 500,000 illegal Jewish settlers. The number has doubled. According to the Israeli Information Center for Human Rights in the Occupied Territories, B'Tselem, they said that Israel has now annexed 42% of the West Bank for the settlements. So if you look at the results, if you look at the outcomes, what we have seen unfold over the past 17 years, a rational person concludes what we saw unfold was an annexation process. It was not a peace process, it was an annexation process. However, the annexation process, it needs the peace process. Because were it not for the peace process, the annexation process couldn't continue. Every time Israel is told it has to stop building settlements, what does Israel say? We have to resolve it in the peace process. And so the peace process is what enables the annexation process. Some of you are thinking, but wait, you're leaving out the most recent history. Wasn't there a settlement freeze? So things have changed for the better. There was a settlement freeze. Technically, it began in November 2009, and it ended in September 26th. And everybody in this room, I'm sure, has heard about that settlement.